Thank you for being here with us. In Jeremiah chapter 7, Jeremiah and the Lord are very upset with the Israelites. They are putting their hope and their trust in material things instead of in the commandments of God. And one of the things they focused on was that they had the temple. And Jerusalem was very proud of the fact that they had the temple. And they kind of thought and believed that the temple was going to save them from the Babylonian captivity God had been warning them about. Something that God tells Jeremiah to say in verse 4 of chapter 7 says, "Do not trust in these lying words, saying, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord are these. For if you thoroughly amend your ways and your doings, if you thoroughly execute judgment between a man and his neighbor, if you do not oppress the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, and do not shed innocent blood in this place, or walk after other gods to your hurt, then I will cause you to dwell in this place, in the land that I gave to your fathers forever and ever." When God rebukes this group of people for the way that they've been living, he does put a focus on the protection of the innocent. And he condemns them that they need to amend their ways in this way. And even if you see here specifically, one of the things that's mentioned is the way that that society treated their widows, that they would steal from them and defraud them and kind of cast them out and let them fend on their own, which what God considered was a death sentence and a punishable offense that God intended to punish. I'm sure many of you have heard different cliches about the way that God views women. If you've been around the block, someone probably has told you that God really doesn't like women, and they're very knowledgeable on the subject. If you've ever been on this thing called the internet before, which maybe should have never been invented in the first place, there's a lot of people on the internet that believe that God just doesn't like women. And they'll tell you all about it, right? And they usually drop these classic cliches or little sayings that they have about how they feel that God just doesn't really like women that much. When people say things like that, it's kind of apparently obvious that they didn't do the reading, and they're doing the talking without the reading. And frankly, we all get in ourselves a lot of troubles when we do the talking and not the reading. So what I like to do tonight is just look very overview-wise the way that God considers his daughters or women, especially when he interacts with them in the Bible. And I think if we actually do the reading, we'll see that God viewed sisters or women in general with much higher standards than man ever has in the history of humankind. And it's very kind of shocking. The U.S. history, and many of y'all know, and I guess if you've read biographies and autobiographies, that's when I've kind of seen it the most. Americans have a habitual trend to steal land from widows. And there's many different stories of different figures that will begin their autobiography with things like, well, my mother had her land stolen from her from another man when my father died. And that seemed to kind of be a habitual trend. And kind of the idea was that when a widow lost her husband, a man could go to whatever they would consider to be their town hall, especially in the 1800s, and they could make an argument that the land was actually deeded to them after the man died. So a widow and her children be forced off their land. And let's just face it, if that person didn't repent and seek forgiveness for what they had done, those men are going to go to hell. And I think that's very clear when you actually do the reading, because God takes the treatment of women very seriously, especially the treatment of widows very seriously. And we can explore that a little bit. You know, when we do the reading, we see stories like this. Moses and Joshua ensured women could own land. And that was something so radical, you're not going to see that in any other ancient history. If y'all remember, Zelophehad's daughters come to Moses, their dad only had daughters. And they asked Moses, is there land for us in the promised land? And what was Moses' and God's answer? Yes, there is land for you in the promised land. The only agreement they want them to make is, if you get married, please don't marry outside the tribe, because we don't want the tribe of Judah to lose their land to another tribe if you married into another tribe. And they seem to be in agreement with that, and they were able to receive land. Years later, when Joshua takes the promised land, it's even brought up that those women reminded Joshua about their land, and Joshua ensured that they received their land. Women could own land. When were women allowed or insured to own land in the United States? It was 1848. And that's when at least one of the first bills was passed in a state that ensured women the right to own land. Now, there were places in different communities in the U.S., even back in the 1700s, that allowed women to own land. But those protections were not ensured by the state law. It was just by people living right and doing the things they were supposed to be doing. But by 1848, you specifically get a bill, again, to protect widows, that ensures that the law, the government, would protect a woman's right to own land. So are we really this forward-thinking society that we believe we are? No, I think we're just always barely catching up. And certainly this is something that God was doing way back before the United States was even thought of. Here's another one, and let's turn to Mark chapter 15. I think this is a wonderful example of the way that God viewed women in the Bible here in the New Testament. This is after Jesus died and was buried and was raised again. Many of y'all remember, at least without John's account, it was the women that followed Jesus all to the bitter end. The apostles fled. In Mark 15, Jesus decides, and I think probably a conscious decision, to first show himself raised to the dead to who? To the female disciples. The male disciples got to see him later. In chapter 15, 9, he reveals himself to Mary Magdalene as being alive. Here in chapter 15, looking again in verse 9, it says, Mark 15, no way, Mark 16. No wonder I couldn't find it. Mark 16, verse 9, when he arose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, out of whom he had cast out 7 demons. She went and told those who had been with him as they mourned and wept. And when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they did not believe. Mary Magdalene is the first person that gets to see the resurrected Jesus. Mary, being the disciple that she is, immediately runs to the other 11 and tells them, I have seen the resurrected Jesus. If we read Matthew's account, we also learn that the women that saw Jesus first were given an instruction by Jesus. It was to go tell the apostles to meet him in Galilee. But when they got Mary's message, how did they treat her? Well, they didn't believe. Look at verse 14. I believe verse 12 is talking about the story to the road to Emmaus in Luke. But let's just jump to 14. Later, he, Jesus, appeared to the 11 as they sat at the table, and he rebuked their unbelief and hardness of heart because they did not believe those who had seen him after he had risen. Jesus rebuked the 11 for not believing Mary Magdalene's testimony that she had saw the raised Jesus. How does God view women? Well, God views women that their testimony should be believed, especially when they're trustworthy people like Mary Magdalene. Many of y'all maybe have heard the cliche that, the Jews didn't believe the testimony of a woman. And that's just something that wasn't allowed. You needed a testimony of a man to be considered legitimate. And the fact of the matter is they're not getting that from the Bible. Who are they getting that from? They're getting that from a line out of Josephus. But let's just face it. Josephus isn't necessarily the person we would call this faithful believer, and he's writing a history book. So I think probably Josephus is right about the way the modern society was treating their women. But does God ever say in the Old Testament we're not to believe the testimony of a woman? No. When I read Leviticus, there were times where a woman was the one that was going to need to sound the alarm and say, this thing is going on, it needs to put a stop to. Now, Jesus believed the testimony of the women, and he expected his apostles to do the same. And again, to us, maybe that'd be something that's obvious. But to the ancient world, this is a huge deal. And finally here, the kingdom existed in many places, specifically because of sisters. And Luke especially is very clear that this is especially because of sisters. Look at Acts 17. This is the chapter that's talking about Paul's journey through northern Greece. And Luke mentions that the reason why they were successful in these cities was because of leading women that sort of took the charge and kept the kingdom going in those areas. Chapter 17, verse 4. It says, and some of them were persuaded, this is in Thessalonica, and a great multitude of the devout Greeks, and not a few of the leading women joined Paul and Silas. Now, Luke likes to say things backwards. When he talks about the big hurricane at the end of Acts, you know what he calls it? He calls it not a small tempest. We go, Luke, why did it just say it was a big tempest, right? Well, what does he say here? Not a few of the leading women. The church at Thessalonica, what did it look like? Well, Luke says it looked like a lot of leading women had started the church at Thessalonica. And that wasn't just true there in Thessalonica. Look at when they go to Berea. Look at verse 12 now with me. Verse 12 here in Berea. Therefore, many of them believed, and also not a few of the Greeks, prominent women as well as men. The church in Berea was also made of these prominent women. And especially the way that Luke talks about it as the leading women or the prominent women, you can't help but think that maybe what's being implied here is that these are women with resources and that they are supporting the work in that area because they're prominent. They can support the work. Back in Philippi, where did the early church meet? Well, at least as far as we know, as Paul and Silas are concerned, they met in Lydia's house, who seemed to be a prominent woman there in Philippi. So does Luke think here that sisters are just kind of unnecessary? No, he thinks that sisters are absolutely necessary for kingdom work. Let's look at one more. Look at Luke chapter 8. We get to make the point here that the original kingdom work was made and done and accomplished by sisters. Look at Luke chapter 8, starting in verse 1. Now it came to pass afterward that he went there from every city and village, preaching and bringing the glad tidings of the kingdom of God. And the 12 were with him, and certain women who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities, Mary called Magdalene, out of whom had come 7 demons, and Joanna the wife of Chuza, Herod's steward, and Susanna, and many others who provided for him from their substance. Here specifically, Luke lists off the female disciples that were with Jesus. But if we look at that very last verse there at the end of verse 3, what did these women specifically do for Christ? I think the thought is that they supported him. Like the reason why Jesus was getting to go from city to city and preaching the kingdom of God is because of these women listed here that supported him in doing so. The original kingdom ministry was supported by sisters, or maybe we should say eventually women that became sisters when the church began, right? So just looking at the examples that we gave very quickly here, if we do the reading, what can we pretty confidently say? No, women really, God does really care about women, and he sees them as co-heirs in Christ. If you go to Galatians specifically, when he looks at the church, does he see barbarian, Scythian, black, white, male, female? No. In Galatians, it says he doesn't see any of those things. He sees Christ's church. And certainly women are very important to God, and he treats them as if they're very important to God, just like how he feels about men. So if we do the reading, it's very hard to make an argument against God for this. I think ultimately what we do is we look at the thing that the world has done, and we try to attribute those things to God, when God would easily point the finger back and say, no, that's y'all's doing. That's not my doing. So if these things exist, and let's kind of boil down here to what I'd like to get to, then why does 1 Timothy 2 exist? Because I imagine if someone has a problem with God and is concerning the way he treats women, this might be the only passage they know about. And this is what they're concerned about. And a sincere heart that's really concerned about a passage, that's the type of person that it would be open to a conversation about a passage if there's a sincere heart behind it. If hopefully you're turning there to 1 Timothy 2 with me here. The beginning of 1 Timothy 2, Paul talks about how we should treat our leaders. We should pray for them, those who are in authority, because they need our prayers. We just need to live a quiet life peaceably among them, because ultimately we're looking forward to God, our Savior. Well, when we get here to verse 8, this is another thing that Paul desires. And let's just read the whole thing, and we'll break it down piece by piece. In 1 Timothy 2:8, I desire, therefore, that the men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands, without wrath and doubting. In like manner also, that the women adorn themselves in modest apparel, with propriety and moderation, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly clothing, but which is proper for women professing godliness with good works. Let a woman learn in silence with all submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or have authority over a man, but to be in silence. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. Nevertheless, she will be saved in childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with self-control. And of course, as usually, I'm reading out the New King James Version, which kind of comes important as we move forward. When I look here at verse 8 very simply, what does he desire from men? Well, he desires for men to pray at church. No, he says, I desire for men to pray everywhere, right? And so right here at the beginning, we're in the everywhere context. This isn't something we just do in the assembly like 1 Corinthians 14. This is an everywhere assembly. And what are men supposed to do everywhere? Well, they're supposed to pray. And that's what he's expecting of men. Just very simply, if we're all around at a dinner table and we're waiting to give thanks for the food, which is something else Paul has commanded us to do, should the women have to beg and plead for one of the men to do it? No, the men should pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands. It should be something that should be seen as a good responsibility. And that's what men have been commanded to do here. Simply, I think the holy hands is very much pairing nicely with something that David said. David said when he was trying to appeal to God in a prayer, and he said, Lord, look at my hands, they're clean, they're holy. And the thought there is that this is a man that is trying to serve the God. He has no wrath, he doesn't doubt. He is very determined to do what he's supposed to do right for in the eyes of the Lord. Verse 9, the like manner, and I think that's the thought of without wrath and doubting, women should clothe themselves in a way that professes godliness. And this works for men as well too. That there, I don't think specifically, we can only say that's only talking about sisters. You think it would be talking about everybody. Our clothes profess something. That's just the way it is. If I dress like a mechanic, which sometimes I do. I remember every time James Taggart came to the building, he asked if I was on my way to the machine shop. I think it's wearing gray shirt and gray pants is really just what gives it away. You profess something by what you wear. Whether you like it or not, you profess something. Sometimes we dress like school teachers. We look like school teachers, right? Sometimes we dress like we go into a machine shop. We look like we work in a machine shop. But also, there are ways that we profess our clothing to say, look, to the best of my ability, I'm trying my best to be a humble and godly person. And I'm dressed in such a manner. Here, the counterexample is someone that is professing that they're rich. And that's what they're trying to profess. And certainly he goes to jewelry, and it wasn't just 100 years ago. People did profess their wealth through jewelry. But I just tell you right now, I'm pretty sure people profess their wealth now by showing off their body, because wealthy is healthy in our culture. And if you're showing off your body, personally, I take it as that you're trying to profess that you're wealthy because you can afford this body. Certainly, that's not the things that Christians profess. Christians profess godliness and good works. But ultimately, here we get to verse 11. Let a woman learn in silence with all submission, which is a hard role. And no one's going to try to argue that that's just some kind of easy thing to do, because it's not necessarily always an easy thing to do. But if we look at this piece by piece, we can make this point very clear. We cannot ignore the passage because we feel like it does not serve us. We can't look at a passage like this and say, well, our culture really disagrees with this, so let's just get rid of it. Let's just not talk about it. Let's just skip over it when it comes up in Bible class, and let's just ignore it to the best of our ability. Can we really call ourselves disciples when we start skipping passages? That's like the worst thing we could be doing, technically. And frankly, people that have called themselves Christians has been doing that for a millennia. 100 years ago, most people were racist. They were easy to find. Do y'all think they sat down there and read Galatians and James and just talked about how important it was that they weren't racist during those days? No, those people that called themselves Christians, quotation marks, they skipped those passages because it made them feel uncomfortable. I cannot be somebody that skips passages because they make me feel uncomfortable. Because what am I when I'm skipping passages because they make me feel uncomfortable? I'd say Matthew 23 calls me a Pharisee, because that's what the Pharisees did. And again, the cliche that the world says about the Pharisees is that they were like Bible beaters that cared so much about the law and they didn't care about anything else. That was not the Pharisees of the Bible. Jesus' condemnation against them was picking and choosing things from the Old Testament that they wanted to practice. Matthew 23, it's easy to remember. These you ought to have done without leaving the others undone. You need to do everything that God commands. We can't skip over things because we don't like parts. And if we do, we're doing the same thing the Pharisees were doing. No, we want to be disciples. We don't skip over passages because they make us feel uncomfortable. And I think certainly that is the real test of a disciple. Paul here, the apostle, it's not like it's just his opinion, forbids a woman to lead the teaching over a man. And there's a reason why I phrase it like that. That it is, I think, specifically talking about the authority and the teaching over a man, which is the issue. I really have a hard time believing that silence and that what's commanded about silence is not the opposite of that statement right there. A woman that is trying to have authority and lead the teaching over a man. Because I have a hard time believing that silence means you don't even make a sound, like literal silence. And maybe that's how the way we would use it. And I think that because women have to sometimes talk to each other in the assemblies. A lot of us are wrestling kids and we're saying, will you take them out? That's not talking about the teaching going on in the assembly. That's talking about we got to deal with something right now. When we talk about singing, we've been all commanded to sing. And certainly when I look at the word silence there, I don't take that as a literal thought of no sound can come out of a woman's mouth when we're concerning spiritual work. I just don't take it that way. I think I take it as this is forbidding a woman to lead the teaching over a man or have an authority over him concerning a spiritual work. I'll also make this point. He does say man. He does not say boy here. And there's a difference between a man and a boy. The reason why I'm so confident that there's a difference between a man and a boy, one of the reasons is Matthew 14:21. In Matthew 14:21, it's the feeding of the 5,000. And it says that the 5,000 men ate, not including women and children. And several times the way that this Greek word man is translated throughout the rest of the New Testament in the King James is the word husband, not necessarily man, even though they understand that sometimes it does mean the word man. But if you look at the third definition in Strong's, it says several times the Bible uses this word to clarify the difference between an adult male and a youth male. And I think in English, we would determine those differences by using the word man versus the word boy. Is a woman here allowed to teach a boy? I think absolutely she's allowed to have authority over a boy. Why? Because she's an adult. And especially in a mother-son relationship, a mother has authority over her son, especially while he's a boy. And she needs to obey him. He needs to obey her. I'm going to get a beating from my mama now because she watches all of my videos. So. He needs to obey her. Why? Because he's a boy and she's her mother. Did Jesus obey his mother? Yes, he did. And that's certainly a great standard for all of us. And so that's what the word is there. It's talking about a man. Now, as well, if this passage or this thought makes people feel uncomfortable, I'll argue that this is not a hill I'm willing to die on. And I'm not going to force anybody to teach something or do something that makes them feel uncomfortable. But it does say what it says. It does not say a man in the Lord. And I think sometimes when we read this passage, we try to pull out a thought here that Paul's only saying a woman does not have the right to teach a Christian man or a believing man or a man in the Lord or something like that. But that's not what the passage says. We're adding to it when we're saying that. We have all experienced, maybe, or most of us have experienced scenarios where you had a good sister teaching a 9 and 8-year-old class here at church, a formal teaching class. And lo and behold, sometime in the quarter, one of the 9-year-old boys, and I'll say boy, decides he wants to obey the gospel. Now, what do? We all try to talk him out of it because he's 9 years old, right? But there are a few, not a lot, there are a few 9-year-old boys that are just absolutely determined that they need to obey the gospel, and they get to a point you feel like you're doing something wrong when you're telling them no for the 15th time. So eventually, he's so determined that we allow him to obey the gospel. His parents allow him to obey the gospel. Well, can a woman still teach in that classroom? I'll tell you what Andrew says, but again, I'm not going to try to force a sister to do something that she's against her conscience. I think a sister can teach in that class because the thought here is not that when the child becomes a believer, all of a sudden now he's a man. That's not being taught here. What's being taught here? A woman does not have the right to teach a man. Not a boy, not even a believing boy, not even a boy in the Lord. That's not in discussion. And certainly, I think there, a woman can still teach a boy, even he's a believer. But I'll say it one more time. I'm not going to try to force some sister to do something that makes her feel uncomfortable. But that's simply not in the passage, some distinction between a believer and an unbeliever. Ultimately, we can say this. Paul is not talking about conversations about God. When brothers and sisters get together, what do we like to talk about? We like to talk about God. We like to talk about the Christ. We like to talk about spiritual things. When we're just sitting around and we're having just some kind of very informal conversation about God, is this one of the contexts that Paul's talking about here? If he is, we're in trouble. Aquila and Priscilla went and taught Apollos more accurately, and I believe that Priscilla was part of that conversation, right? Not an informal teaching situation, but part of the conversation as well. Mary ran to the 11, and she said, I've seen the raised Jesus. He told me to tell you to go to Galilee. Did any of the 11 look at her and say, a woman is to learn in silence with all submission? No, because there was no formal teaching setting there. The idea was not like, okay, we're going to have a Bible study together and I'm going to teach you something. And today I'm going to teach you that I just saw Jesus raised from the dead. That's not what was going on. That was a conversation. She ran in the room. She said, I've seen the risen Lord. And they didn't believe her. And they were rebuked for their unbelief. We're allowed to talk about God. And certainly we learn things from each other in those conversations. But those purposes of those conversations themselves is not to teach. The purpose of those conversations really are just to enjoy each other's company. And of course, I enjoy talking about God, and I think you do too. Ultimately, after we've gotten all this, why would Paul the apostle forbid a woman to lead the teaching over a man? Well, the answer is not some psychology argument. The answer is not some social argument. And I think sometimes our knee-jerk reaction is we wish there was some kind of sociology argument for this. But there's not. There's not one, at least in the text. There might be really good reasons, but it's not here. The two arguments Paul gives is one is because Adam was created first. That's the first reason he gives, right? We get to verse 13. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. What's the reason? The reason is because the race of men were here first, and God has the expectation that they would do the teaching. And really, there's nothing to add to that. That's just how God sees it. And I can't skip something that God sees just because it doesn't fit well with my beliefs about the way personally the culture should be ran. Here's the second reason. The second reason is because Adam was not deceived by Satan, but Eve was. 14, Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. The way the story plays out here, and we get a little bit of this in Genesis 2 and 3, is that Satan came to Eve and lied to her about what the fruit would do. He lied and said, well, this is a good thing. It'll make you like God. Evidently, Eve, based off this passage, believed the lie. She legitimately believed it. She did believe that it would be good for her to disobey God. Satan got her. And I'll be completely sympathetic. I don't think Andrew could have a conversation with Satan and Satan not trick me on something, all right? I'm not thinking she was some gullible woman. I think she was dealing with the devil. And the devil did trick her. When Eve came and gave the fruit to Adam, was he also tricked about what that fruit was going to do to them? According to Paul here, Adam knew what was going on, and he ate anyway. He was not deceived by the devil, but he still sinned. Maybe that means that Adam knew better, but did it anyway. And that's Paul's second reason for this command. I've heard this story spin many different ways, and I can't spin it a certain way because Paul doesn't spin it in a certain way. He ends it here. And I'll be happy to talk to you in the foyer about different ways I've heard people spin this story. Is it better that Eve ate believing she was doing the right thing? Or is it better that Adam knew better, but he did it anyway? Or would we argue the opposite, that it's worse that Adam knew better, but did it anyway? I have no idea. And there's really not much I want to say anymore in a sermon time about it. But whatever had happened, the fact is that Adam was not tricked, but Eve was. And so some people kind of look at it like this. And I don't think this is a bad reason. I think it's a fair thought. Perhaps it is his punishment that his sons will now be responsible for the teaching of God's ordinances because he knew better and he did it anyway. And if someone held that position, I wouldn't fight them about it, right? I'd be like, okay, I understand why you hold that position. But regardless of however we hold the position about what that thought means right there, I think we all can pull out this word and we'll all agree and stand on this word. And that word is responsibility. God has given the responsibility of teaching the gospel to men. He's given them that responsibility. Women have also been given teaching responsibilities in other passages. They're just not here. It's specifically talking about teaching other women and teaching children. Certainly there's parts of the Bible that talk about that. But the thought is, responsibility-wise, is that men have been given that responsibility. They've been given that role. And Paul talks about it twice. To try to level with it. And maybe this is just my perspective, and that's okay if you disagree with my perspective. There are services I've been to, church services. There's been formal Bible classes I've been to, these formal Bible classes that were just terrible. I mean, like, the service was just bad. And it was just thrown sloppily together. No one had any idea where we were going. We didn't know what we were doing. And it just felt like a very sloppy job of us trying to throw a service together. Whose fault is that? I think that's the men's fault. Because who are the only people here given the responsibility for the formal teaching? The men are. So whose fault is it? Are we going to blame the sisters for that? I can't blame the sisters for that. I can't at all. And so in my mind, it does give us the responsibility that services are handled well and properly because the men did what God commanded them to do. And in my mind, when you don't have that responsibility, it's a little freeing. There's some anxiety that's lifted about that because God isn't holding you accountable to those things, right? I really enjoy it when Jason preaches. Why? I don't have to work on a sermon. I get to let a sermon work on me. And there's something enjoyable about that. I come and I sit down and I listen to a sermon. And the sermon works on me and I'm thinking about it, for the rest of the week because it's what I was last left with. When you're preaching, guys, it's the opposite. I don't know if y'all know this. I think about a sermon all week and then I release it on Sunday. And guys, I don't want to talk about that sermon anymore. I'm on to something different because I've been thinking about it for 7 days. But when you do it the other way around and it's not your responsibility to do the teaching, you get to enjoy the food. And certainly I think that there might be something good about not having this responsibility. And again, that's my perspective. And you can say, Andrew, I disagree with that perspective. But certainly I think responsibility is the key word here and what we need to hone in on. Well, as we get here to verse 15 might be one of the most difficult passages in the New Testament. And I'm not going to try to pretend like I'm going to give up here and give you some great answer. If you read the NET, which some of y'all do, there's a block in the NET that explains 1,000-year English translator fight about how verse 15 should be translated. So the translators have been fighting about it for years. But this is the best thing I can do with verse 15. And just to read it one more time, he says, nevertheless, she will be saved in childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with self-control. Let's easily put out what Paul's not saying here. Paul cannot be saying a woman has to have children to be saved. He can't be saying that. And the reason why I'm very confident he can't be saying that is because passages like 1 Corinthians 7:34, when he specifically tells sisters, it would be good for you to be unmarried. Because if you're unmarried, you will serve the Lord with even more time since you aren't concerned with a family. And Paul paints that as a very good thing. Paul compares that to himself. that he as an unmarried person gets a whole lot more done for the Lord than he would if he's married. And that's very logically true. And I don't believe Paul's saying one thing here and saying completely opposite in 1 Corinthians 7. I'd also add this. What about our founders of the kingdom? Abraham and Sarah. Was Sarah lost until she had Isaac? Because as we know the story, having a child was not in the cards for Sarah. She was past that. No, I think I can even go to Romans 4 and sort of make a very powerful argument that no, Abraham and Sarah were saved when they obeyed God, long before God blessed her with that child. And so it'd be very difficult to make this thought that he's saying a woman have to have children to be saved. That wouldn't even fit in with those disciple women that we met in Luke 8. Is he just saying, though, then women will not die in childbirth? Some people take it that way. Nevertheless, she'll be saved in childbearing, like a literal salvation. Well, we run into some issues if we take that stance too. Let me compare this to Ephesians 6, 1 through 3. Ephesians 6 is, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Paul says this is the first commandment with a promise, that you will live long on the earth. Well, are there children that still obey their parents to the best of their ability, but they do not live long on the earth? Yeah, we know of children that are very faithful and very devout that died way too young. One of them's name was Jesus Christ, who did listen to his parents, but still died in his early 30s. So what we take Paul's reasoning there to be is not some promise for a literal carnal world, but instead we look at that passage and say, well, this is a general principle, that if you listen to your parents, you probably will live longer. Every time I teach it, I say it like this. If your parents tell you not to play with gasoline, you probably will live longer if you obey them, right? And I think that's the general principle of Ephesians 6. And maybe that's the general principle here. But again, it's very weird and strange for a New Testament passage to promise some kind of carnal salvation when obviously most of the New Testament, if not all of it, is about spiritual salvation. So I don't lean towards this being some carnal promise. There's plenty of good, faithful women that have passed in childbirth, even though they did all the things listed in this passage and in all the passages. So what might he be saying instead? Well, what about this? And this is usually the argument people make, verse 15, that there's a she will be saved if they, that it goes from singular to plural in the middle of the sentence. Maybe what Paul's saying is that we all, and maybe even specifically they all women are saved by the power of childbirth by one birth, the seed of woman. Because what have we been talking about in this section? We've been talking about Adam and Eve. When Eve was deceived and she ate, God got Adam, Eve, and Satan right there, and he handed out the curses. And Adam's curse was bad, and Eve's curse was bad, and Satan's curse was the worst. But when we read Genesis 3 and we see that Satan is told that, look, Eve has this curse, she'll have pain in childbearing, but eventually through that curse of childbearing, she'll bring about the seed of woman that will avenge her, basically, of you. We all know that to be as the promise of the Messiah. Apparently, Eve knew something about it too, because when Abel died and she had Seth, what did she say? She said, God has given me another seed to fulfill that promise that he made to me. And ultimately, of course, that goes all the way down to Mary, who has a son who has no earthly father, and that's why he is the Messiah, Jesus, the seed of woman. So, aren't we all saved by the power of childbearing? Aren't we all saved by the curse of Eve? We are all saved from the curse of Eve because that's the power that brought the Messiah to earth. And I can even make it really practical. This is 1 Corinthians 11. Aren't we all here because of the power of childbirth? Right? Like, isn't that the only reason why I exist? Is that mothers could bring life into this world? Yeah, of course. And something that obviously the curse was a negative thing. God used it for his glory to bring about the Messiah. So I don't think he's saying that women all have to have children here. I think he's practically saying that we were all saved based off one childbirth, the seed of woman. And what is that clarified with? It's clarified with something that makes a whole lot of sense. Salvation is conditional by continuance in faith, love, and holiness and self-control? Was Eve going to be saved just because she brought Seth into the world? Nah. Eve was going to be saved because she continued in faith, love, holiness, and self-control. Was Mary going to be saved just because she brought Jesus into the world? It was a great service she did to God and all mankind. But no, she was going to be saved because she continued in faith, love, and holiness and self-control. Let's just bring in the men. How are men going to be saved? Men too are going to be saved because we continue in faith, love, holiness, and self-control. Those are the things that help us access the Messiah's love. And certainly that's what we all need to be looking forward to. Thank you for your close attention. And if hopefully that would be kind of like a talking points that we can use when we talk with other people. I'll say this very quickly. You know, often, and y'all have been a part of groups that have had ladies' classes. We've had ladies' classes. We've had ladies teach ladies' classes. Y'all know when y'all have a ladies' class, you don't have to just teach like women in the Bible. Y'all all know that already. You know, I think often we get in this like kind of stereotype that, okay, we're going to have a ladies' class. Y'all are going to go over Sarah and Rebecca, and then we'll jump to Ruth. Okay, now we'll do Proverbs 31, and we'll do Esther. Class will be dismissed. That's fine to do those things. And honestly, men should be sitting in studies that do go like that about too. But do sisters, should they get together and study Ecclesiastes? Absolutely. Should sisters get together and study the first half of Proverbs instead of just the last little bit? Absolutely they should. And I would even argue Proverbs 31 is written to a man. It's a mother speaking to his son. That's actually kind of, in my mind, a chapter directed towards men. Can sisters get together and study the Gospel of Mark? Absolutely they can, and they should, because those books were written to them as much as all the books were written to everyone. And certainly that's because we have a God that desires for all men and women to come into Christ. If there's anyone here we can help join Christ tonight, why don't you let us come forward as you stand and sing.